Alright, there won't be another Tiananmen Square in China, not in the near future. Unless something drastically happens in the world, I'm not talking about this trade war. It would have to be something global, like the World War III or global calamity. I know this is going to piss off a lot of people. I can hear people start listing all the bad stuff China did, that supposedly did in the past. Ethnic conflict, the failing economy, unemployment in China, party infighting within the Communist Party. The list is too long, but none of it will make another Tiananmen Square happen in China. Let me remind you of a simple fact. China in the 1980s was in an economic boom. After Deng Xiaoping adopted the market economy in the late 70s, in 1989, when Tiananmen Square happened, Chinese people's standard of living were at the peak since the founding of the People's Republic of China. This is why I see people like Gordon Chang, this guy, still getting TV appearance and guest speaker opportunity in the United States. I get extremely irritated. This guy had been predicting the collapse of China for at least 20 years. He is like the laughing stock in China. That's his opinion. I don't mind people having different opinions. What I care about is that mainstream media and academia still take his worldview seriously. As a Chinese immigrant coming to the United States, staying here, I'm not pro-China at all. But by having this delusion in mainstream media that one day China is just going to collapse like 1989 and go away, it's asinine. It's reckless, and it will make the U.S. foreign policy against China fail over and over again, just like it did in the past 20, 30 years. So I'm going to tell you why I think there won't be an Tiananmen Square in China. The protest originally started as a tribute to the passing of Chairman Hu Yaobang, who advocated for some degree of human right and check and balance in China. It started in April and lasted until June, so the first thing to note here is that the event is not just a few days where students showed up and government crushed it. No, there were a lot of back and forth between the government and student negotiations before Deng Xiaoping eventually decided to crush the protest. If you look at what the student wanted back then, here's a list of the 7 requests that students initially asked for. It's 100% political. There's nothing about the economy. They were asking for democracy and freedom, transparency, independent media, education funding. This is the first point I want to emphasize. No economic downturn is going to create this type of student-led ideological protest in China. Bad economy, unemployment, and for that matter, even ethnic conflicts, let's say between Han Chinese and Chinese Muslims. These problems can create local protest. It will not reach national level. With the economy, there are also a lot of other tools the party can use to ease tension. Looking at this list again, a lot of it echoes Western democratic ideologies. And this is the main reason Tiananmen Square won't happen again, because Chinese people no longer look up to the United States as a role model. For those that don't know or don't remember, back in the 1980s, China was actually very close to the United States. America wanted to use China as a balance to the Soviet Union. U.S. recognized China in the United Nations over Taiwan. There were countless exchanges in science, technology, and culture. The U.S. goal was through economic reform, maybe show some goodwill to the Chinese people and have the people push for political changes. To a large degree, that worked very well. The Reagan administration actually sold anti-tank missiles, Black Hawks, radars, and torpedoes to China. Had it not been for Tiananmen Square, the U.S. was evaluating sending China F-16 fighters, all to counter the Soviet Union. If people are interested, I can deep dive into the timeline for Tiananmen Square in another video, but here we're more concerned about today. See, that friendly, mutually dependent relationship between China and the United States is gone. Russia today is not the Soviet Union of past. U.S. have clearly labeled China as its biggest threat. Correctly, I think. But because the two countries have become adversaries, there's really no longer a soil for grassroots revolution in China. At least not one under the auspice of Western democracy. I would argue the idea of Western democracy in China really died on Tiananmen Square in 1989. I grew up in Beijing. 1989, I was just a kid, so I don't remember much, but after I came to the US, I've talked to plenty of family members who experienced it firsthand. I've watched documentaries and read memoirs about the event. It is quite painful to read through that period and see the escalation that eventually led to bloodshed. Chinese government at the time were led by mostly authoritarian leaders, but there were a significant democratic faction. There was an opportunity to de-escalate when the central government agreed to 3 out of the 7 requests by students I mentioned earlier. But the student leaders were very inexperienced. They decided to require unanimous vote to accept the government's term. and that, of course, did not pass. Students insisted on the government to adopt all 7 requests, and they added 3 more later on. When the negotiation was clearly not working, the authoritarian faction led by Deng Xiaoping started to take control of the narrative, and the students became more hostile as well, labeling Deng as the emperor without a crown, since Deng technically did not hold any political position within the party at the time. He was the chairman for the military commission. Now, most Western media only focus on the students on Tiananmen Square. That's really missing the bigger picture. What really got Chinese government worried was the spreading of the protest. The idea of freedom and democracy, check and balance, was so widespread in China that protests erupted in over 100 cities in May of 1989. And it spread to beyond just the student organizations. Teachers, workers, you have farmers, even judges and bankers took to the street to support the student against supposedly corrupt government officials. This escalation was what really scared the Chinese government. In May, some local newspaper and radio stations in Beijing have gone out against the government instruction and start covering the student protest. If you know anything about authoritarianism, is that they cannot lose control of the media. That is the bottom line. Deng had asked the military to disperse the students on several occasions. Even many military officers refused to use violence against their own citizens. It is this reluctance that perhaps scared Deng even more. He realized that the party was actually losing control of the country. He had to pull the 38th Army Group from a different province overnight to crush the student protest. When it happened in the early morning of June 4th, 1989, it was mostly local Beijing workers that were shot and killed as the army rolled in to impose martial law, not necessarily the students. These people had blocked the army before with success, so they thought this time it would be the same, but they were wrong. This time the soldiers came from a different province. The soldiers were indoctrinated that this was a counter-revolutionary revolt that had to be put down. My relatives had told me that she went to one of the main hospitals on June 4th and saw hundreds of people laying on stretchers in the hallways and lobbies. The students, on the other hand, were given the opportunity to leave the square peacefully once the army got there, and they were largely unharmed. Many of the student leaders escaped China to the west and told their stories as if they were the main characters. It's understandable. But sadly, in reality, in any conflict, it's usually the people without voice that got hurt the most. And on that night, it was the Beijing locals that got hurt. The political fallout is Western countries out-sanctioned China, isolated China, but in a way it solidified the Chinese Communist Party's power. The democratic faction within governments was completely purged. The protest was used to justify more extreme control over higher education and media. Recently, Marco Rubio has been blasting the decision to let China join the WTO as the moment when U.S. allowed China's economic rise in hoping it will become more democratic. Politicians have short memories. There was not a single event in China after the year 2000 that even remotely came close to Tiananmen Square. Like I said, Western democracy in China died in 1989. American politicians just refused to accept the fact for the past 30 plus years. That is the delusion, the stupidity I'm talking about. Be it the Chinese Muslims or Hong Kong protests, these human rights violation accusations are not going to destabilize China, because China no longer has the soil for Western democracy. When America presents itself as a hostile force, you don't earn the trust of Chinese people. And the Trump administration certainly made it worse. Back in 2019, when the Hong Kong student protest started, so many Western journalists got these romanticized flashbacks to Tiananmen Square because the students were promoting similar ideas. At the time, I wrote in a post that predicted the protest will get nowhere because it would not gain any sympathy from anywhere else in China. They were basically requesting things that were not available to any other Chinese citizens. Without that nationwide protest, the government can wait you out and slowly choke off your lifeline. And that was exactly what happened. I made this video because I'm starting to hear these stupid arguments again. Oh, we're just going to hurt China some more, make them suffer, and they'll cave. If they don't cave, their whole country is going to fall apart. If anything, Trump's policy is uniting China even more. Now, Xi Jinping can point to Donald Trump and say, look, American-led global alliance is over. Western democracy has always been an excuse for economic exploitation, because that's what Donald Trump is doing. When Donald Trump is literally extorting the global economy, China now have a definitive external adversary, an excuse for all its internal problems. Xi Jinping is a very cunning politician. His rise is not an accident. If Russia can survive 3 years of regional war and Western sanctions, China can survive this economic downturn. I would even argue that these next 2-3 years is a rare opportunity for China to pressure Taiwan for reunification. I wouldn't be surprised at all if China would ask for concession on Taiwan for the upcoming tariff negotiation. That's a separate topic, but I think a U.S. administration as selfish and incompetent as this one only comes by once every 50 years, if not a century. We really should just forget these fantasies about China's collapse because of some ideological revolution. Perhaps Trump can still get a portion of Americans to believe that the U.S. is still the symbol for freedom and democracy, but most around the world sees differently. See, this is something that Trump has not realized yet. By authoritarian leader standard, Trump is an amateur. If he abandons the ideological high ground and tries to negotiate deals with these real dictators that have been scheming their whole life, Trump will lose 9 out of 10 times. You have Russia, less than 10% of the GDP of the United States, completely outmaneuvering Donald Trump. You hear in the news, the only concession Russia is giving on the table is to, quote, not take over the whole country of Ukraine. Then from the perspective of Xi Jinping, when Xi Jinping is looking at this, and you think he can't understand that this is an opportunity for China? I watch late night shows and we have comedians tearing the Trump administration apart line by line, the audience laughing at the absurdity. To be fair, I laugh with them too, but years down the line, I suspect we're going to look back at this period and realize how unfunny these policies are.
On Air Force One when Trump doubled down on the dollies.
All I'm saying is that you don't, that a young lady, a 10-year-old girl,